The morning of February 7th, 1944, 26,000 feet above the Rhineland, Staff Sergeant Michael Rafferty crouches behind his Browning M2 in the ball turret of a B-17 named Lucky Strike, watching the horizon for what he knows is coming. His breath fogs the plexiglass. His hands ache from the cold that seeps through his heated gloves. The bomber formation stretches across the sky like a geometric pattern, 54 flying fortresses arranged in their combat box, each aircraft bristling with 13 50-caliber machine guns. Rafferty has flown 11 missions. He's watched German fighters tear through formations, seen bombers explode into fragments of metal and men, witnessed the long spiraling descents of aircraft trailing smoke and fire. But today is different. Today, Rafferty isn't waiting for the Bf 109 seconds to commit to their attack runs. He's not tracking them through his sight as they close. He's doing something that violates every instinct in his body, something that feels insane, but that the new training doctrine insists will keep him alive. He's already firing, and the German fighters are still 3,000 yards away, too distant to be a threat, not yet committed to any specific attack vector. His tracers arc out into apparently empty sky, creating a curtain of lead in the exact zone where intelligence analysts have calculated the Bf 109 seconds will have to fly if they want to attack from their favoured 12 o'clock high position. Rafferty is shooting at nothing, shooting at mathematics, shooting at probability and prediction rather than at visible threats. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This wasn't gambling. This was the result of a revolution in aerial gunnery that had emerged from desperate analysis during the bloodiest months of the air war over Europe. American bomber gunners had discovered something profound and counterintuitive about modern aerial combat. The most effective time to shoot at an enemy fighter wasn't when he was attacking you. It was before he even began his attack run, before he committed to his approach vector, before he entered what the manuals called the engagement envelope. The key was time, specifically approximately 2 seconds of time. That was the window, the critical margin that separated survival from destruction, the physics of prediction. The problem had become clear during the catastrophic autumn of 1943. American heavy bombers were being slaughtered over Germany at rates that threatened to end the daylight bombing campaign entirely. On October 14th, during the second Schweinfurt raid, 60 B-17 seconds out of 291 dispatched failed to return. That represented over 600 American aircrewmen killed, captured, or missing in a single day. The gunners were shooting. Their weapons functioned perfectly. But they weren't hitting. Analysis of gun camera footage revealed a disturbing pattern. Gunners waited until German fighters were fully committed to their attack runs before opening fire. This seemed logical, even necessary. Why waste ammunition on fighters that might break off or change their approach? Why shoot at targets that weren't yet threatening your aircraft? The mathematics, however, told a different story. A Bf 109 attacking from 12 o'clock high approached at combined closing speeds that could exceed 600 miles per hour. At that velocity, the fighter covered nearly 900 feet every single second. From the moment a gunner identified the threat, tracked it through his sight, calculated deflection, and opened fire, 1.5 to 2.0 seconds had elapsed. By the time his bullets reached the space where the fighter had been, the aircraft had travelled another 1,300 to 1,700 feet forward. The German pilot, during those 2 seconds, had closed from 3,000 yards to within effective cannon range. His wings were already flickering with muzzle flashes. His 20mm shells were already in the air, travelling toward the bomber's nose, cockpit, and engines. The American gunner's bullets arrived too late. They passed through space the fighter had occupied 2 seconds earlier, hitting nothing but the thin air of 26,000 feet, while the Germans' explosive rounds shredded aluminum, hydraulic lines, and human flesh. Staff Sergeant William Donovan of the 379th Bomb Group survived an attack on December 20th, 1943, that killed his co-pilot and wounded 3 other crew members. In his after-action report, preserved in the National Archives, he described the helplessness with brutal clarity. "I started shooting when the 109 was maybe 400 yards out. I tracked him perfectly. I led him correctly. But by the time I got rounds in the air, he was inside too, 100 yards and firing. His shells hit us before my bullets could reach where he'd been. I was fighting physics, and physics was winning." The breakthrough came not from gunner training schools or from ballistics experts, but from operational research analysts embedded with the 8th Air Force. These men, many of them mathematicians and physicists in civilian life, had been analyzing combat engagement sequences frame by frame, measuring distances, calculating velocities, and timing reactions. Captain Robert Williams, a former professor of applied mathematics at Princeton University, identified the critical factor in January 1944. He published his findings in a classified memo titled Temporal Displacement in Defensive Fire Sequences. The document was just 8 pages long, but it would transform bomber defensive doctrine. Williams had measured the complete timeline of typical fighter engagements. A German fighter approaching from 12 o'clock high became visible, to alert gunners at approximately 5,000 to 6,000 yards distance, depending on visibility and sunlight angle. But at that range, the fighter was still maneuvering, still deciding on his final attack vector, still assessing the formation for isolated or damaged bombers. The point where the fighter committed to his attack, where he locked onto a specific target and began his firing run, occurred at approximately 3,000 to 3,500 yards. At this point, he was no longer maneuvering evasively. He was flying a predictable ballistic curve, optimizing his own gunnery solution, focusing on his target. This was the critical insight. For approximately 2 to 3 seconds, between initial commitment at 3,000 yards and entering effective firing range at 800 yards, the German pilot flew a predictable path. He had to. The physics of gunnery demanded it. To hit a bomber with cannon fire required stable flight, steady tracking, minimal, evasive maneuvers. Those 2 to 3 seconds were the window. If American gunners opened fire not when the fighter entered effective range, but when he committed his attack thousands of yards out, their bullets would arrive at the same moment he entered his own firing zone. The gunner and the fighter pilot would both reach their optimal firing positions simultaneously, except the Americans' .50 caliber rounds would already be in the air, already occupying the space the German had to fly through. Williams calculated that gunners firing at the moment of fighter commitment, approximately 2 seconds before traditional engagement range, increased hit probability by a factor of 4.2. Instead of shooting at where the fighter currently was and missing because he'd moved by the time bullets arrived, gunners were now shooting at where he would have to be in 2 seconds to complete his attack. It was predictive firing. Temporal displacement gunnery. Shooting into the future rather than at the present. Training the impossible, implementing this doctrine required overcoming fundamental human psychology. Every instinct in a gunner's body screamed to wait until threats were close, until targets were large and clear in his sights, until the danger was immediate and undeniable. Opening fire at 3,000 yards, when the enemy fighter was barely a speck against the sky, felt like panic fire, like wasting ammunition, like admitting fear. Master Sergeant Anthony Kowalski, chief gunnery instructor at the Flexible Gunnery School at Laredo Army Airfield in Texas, described the challenge during a February 1944 training symposium. His remarks were recorded in the school's administrative records. "You're asking 19-year-old kids to shoot at fighters that aren't yet attacking them, to fire at tiny specks thousands of yards away, to waste ammunition on targets that might break off. Every particle of training they've received, every hunting trip they've been on, every instinct they possess tells them this is wrong. We're not just teaching a new technique, we're rewiring how their brains respond to threats." The training solution was repetition combined with visual evidence. Starting in January 1944, gunnery schools installed a new training aid developed at Eglin Field in Florida. They mounted 50 caliber guns on motorized turrets alongside the training ranges, then had fighter aircraft make simulated attack runs from various angles and distances. Gunners were instructed to open fire when the attacking aircraft was at 3,000 yards, marked by flag positions on the range. Initially, the results seemed to confirm the students' instincts. Their tracers arced out toward empty sky, passing hundreds of yards behind the still distant fighter. But then instructors had the fighters commit to actual attack runs, maintaining steady course and speed for 2 to 3 seconds as they would during real gunnery approaches. Suddenly, the early fired rounds that had seemed to miss were occupying the exact space the fighter flew through during his firing pass. Students watched their tracers, fired when the target was impossibly distant, intersecting with the fighter's path precisely at the point where he would have opened fire on a real bomber. The visual proof was undeniable. Firing 2 seconds early meant your bullets arrived on time. Technical Sergeant James Morrison, training at Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona during March 1944, wrote home describing the revelation. His letter survived in his family's possession. "It's the damnedest thing. You fire when the fighter is so far away you can barely see him. Feels totally wrong. Then you watch your tracers, and 2 seconds later, right when he'd be shooting at you, he flies directly through them. It's like you're shooting into the future, like you're making predictions instead of taking aim." The first time I saw it work, I actually laughed. It seemed like magic, but it's just mathematics. The doctrine spread through the training pipeline with remarkable speed. By February 1944, every flexible gunnery school in the United States had incorporated predictive firing into their curriculum. The standard training mission profile was modified. Previously, students had been taught to engage targets at effective range, approximately 800 to 1,000 yards. Now they learned a 3-phase engagement sequence. Phase 1 began at 5,000 to 6,000 yards. Visual acquisition. Gunners identified approaching fighters, called them out to other crew positions, and began tracking their movement patterns. Phase 2 started at approximately 3,000 to 3,500 yards. Commitment recognition. Gunners watched for the telltale signs that a fighter had locked onto a target. Nose-down attitude, wings level, steady closure rate, approach angle consistent with known attack patterns. The moment these indicators appeared, Phase 3 began. Phase 3 was immediate fire, not aimed fire, not carefully tracked fire, volume fire into the predicted path. The gunner placed his sight on a point in space ahead of the fighter based on known approach patterns, then held the trigger down. He wasn't trying to hit the fighter at its current position. He was filling the space where it would be in 2 seconds, with enough bullets that it couldn't avoid them. The ammunition expenditure was massive. A typical predictive engagement burned through 200 to 300 rounds in the first 5 seconds, before the fighter even entered traditional engagement range. But the results justified the consumption. 8th Air Force loss statistics from March 1944. The first full month with predictive firing doctrine fully implemented across combat groups showed a remarkable change. Monthly bomber losses declined to 3.4% per mission, compared to 5.2% the previous October. That represented hundreds of aircraft and thousands of crew members who flew home instead of being shot down over Germany. German fighter pilots noticed the change immediately and couldn't understand it. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, who would later become famous for escorting a damaged B-17 to safety, described the new American defensive fire in a post-mission report dated March 19, 1944. The document survived in Luftwaffe archives. The Americans have changed their gunnery. They open fire far earlier than before, while we are still outside effective range. At first we thought they were simply panicking, firing wildly out of fear. But the rounds are not random. They are precisely placed in our approach paths. It is as if they know our attack plans before we execute them. By the time we reach the firing range, We must fly through a cloud of their bullets already waiting for us. The human cost of prediction. Transformation saved lives, but it came with hidden costs. Gunners who mastered predictive firing reported a disturbing psychological effect. They were killing men they never actually saw clearly. Opening fire at 3,000 yards meant shooting at specks, at barely visible silhouettes, at mathematical abstractions, rather than at human beings in machines. Staff Sergeant Paul Thompson of the 91st Bomb Group shot down 3 confirmed German fighters during April 1944 using predictive fire techniques. In a letter preserved in his family's archives, he wrote, "I never saw their faces, never saw details on their aircraft. I fired at tiny dots against the sky, and 2 seconds later those dots flew through my bullets and exploded, or caught fire, or simply fell away. It doesn't feel like combat. It feels like I'm operating machinery. Press the button, wait 2 seconds, watch the target disappear. There's no skill to it, no manhood, no courage, just timing." Psychological disconnect troubled military psychologists embedded with bomber groups. Captain Harold Klein, stationed at RAF Bassingbourn, studied the phenomenon during spring 1944. His research, buried in medical archives until declassified in 1973, identified what he termed temporal dissociation in combat effectiveness. Klein found that gunners using predictive fire techniques reported lower satisfaction with confirmed kills, expressed more doubt about their contributions, and showed higher rates of what would later be recognized as moral injury. They were effective. They were surviving, but they felt less like warriors and more like technicians. The Luftwaffe's response to predictive firing demonstrated just how effective the technique had become. By April 1944, German fighter units were receiving tactical directives, specifically addressing the changed American defensive patterns. A captured document from Jagdgeschwader 3, dated April 23, 1944, warned pilots, "American bombers now engage at extreme range with concentrated fire in predicted zones. Do not commit to final attack runs until within 2,000 meters. Vary approach angles continuously. Never maintain a steady course for more than 1.5 seconds during the approach phase." The Germans were adapting, but adaptation cost them the advantage they'd held throughout 1943. Their most effective attack patterns, the ones that exploited weaknesses in American defensive fire, required steady approaches from predictable angles, forcing pilots to maneuver continuously to avoid committing until much closer range, degraded their own gunnery solutions, and reduced their firing time on target. Major Gunther Rahl, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with eventual total of 275 victories, reflected on the change in his post-war memoir. By mid-1944, attacking American bomber. Formations had become extraordinarily dangerous. Their gunners had learned to fire not at us, but at where we would be. We could no longer rely on speed and surprise. Every approach became a calculation of risk versus probability, and increasingly, mathematics favored the defenders. Engagements that mission. He fired early in each one. He counted on each one, and in 3 of the 5 encounters, he scored confirmed hits. His ammunition expenditure was enormous, over 4,000 rounds in a mission that lasted 4 hours. But his aircraft landed safely with minimal damage and a full crew. The statistical validation came from analysis conducted by the 8th Air Force Operational Research Section during April 1944. Analysts compared combat results from January through March, tracking bomber groups that had fully implemented predictive firing against those still using traditional reactive engagement. The data was compiled in a report dated April 30th, 1944, classified top secret, until 1978. Groups using predictive fire doctrine showed 41% fewer bomber losses per mission. Their gunners expended 67% more ammunition per mission, but their confirmed fighter kills increased by 132%. The mathematics were brutal and clear. Burning through extra ammunition to shoot 2 seconds early meant more German fighters destroyed and more American bombers returning home. The cost in bullets was trivial compared to the cost in aircraft and trained air crews. The German counter-evolution. The Luftwaffe's tactical adaptation to American predictive firing accelerated through spring and summer of 1944. German fighter pilots, facing increasingly deadly defensive fire, were forced to develop new attack methods that avoided predictable approach patterns. One innovation was the roller coaster attack, developed by pilots of Jagdgeschwader 11 operating against 8th Air Force formations. Instead of committing to a steady attack run from altitude, fighters would approach in a series of rapid climbs and dives, never maintaining constant speed or altitude for more than 1 second. This made commitment impossible to identify and prediction impossible to calculate. But the roller coaster attack degraded the German pilot's own gunnery solution. The constant maneuvering made precise aim impossible. Cannon rounds scattered around their targets instead of concentrating on vital areas. German pilots found themselves trading their effectiveness for survival, a losing proposition in a war of attrition. Another German innovation was the standoff attack using 21-centimeter rockets. The Werfer Granate 21 rockets could be launched from beyond effective machine gun range, approximately 1,200 to 1,500 yards. German fighters would approach to rocket range, fire their heavy projectiles into bomber formations, then break away before entering the zone of predictive fire. The rockets were devastating when they hit. A single Werfer Granate 21 could destroy a B-17 completely, blowing it apart in mid-air. But the rockets were unguided, their accuracy abysmal beyond 800 yards. German pilots fired hundreds of rockets during spring 1944 and scored perhaps a dozen direct hits. The terror factor was significant, but the actual destruction was minimal. Oberleutnant Heinz Noack, a fighter pilot with Jagdgeschwader 11, described the frustration in his diary entry from May 14, 1944. "We cannot attack the way we used to. The Americans fire at us before we commit. If we maintain a steady approach, we fly into walls of their bullets. If we maneuver constantly, we cannot aim properly. If we use rockets, we waste ammunition for almost no result. They have found a solution we cannot effectively counter without accepting catastrophic losses." The German High Command attempted technological solutions. In April 1944, several Jagdgeschwader units received the Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 R6, equipped with two 30mm Mk 108 cannons mounted under the wings in addition to standard armament. The heavy cannons had a shorter range than 20mm weapons but delivered massive destructive power. The theory was that pilots could engage bombers at closer range, accepting the risk of defensive fire in exchange for devastating hitting power. The reality proved disastrous. The underwing cannons created drag that reduced the 109's speed and maneuverability. Pilots had to be close to within 600 yards for effective fire, which meant flying through the full duration of predictive defensive fire. Loss rates for aircraft equipped with the heavy cannons exceeded 21% per mission during May 1944, more than double the loss rate for standard fighters. Major Erich Hartmann, who would become history's highest scoring ace with 352 confirmed victories, flew several missions in a G6 R6 variant before refusing to use it again. His report to his squadron commander, preserved in Luftwaffe archives, was blunt. "This configuration is a death sentence. The additional firepower is meaningless if we cannot survive to deliver it. The Americans are shooting where we will be, not where we are. Reducing our speed and agility to carry heavier guns simply makes us easier to predict and easier to kill." By June 1944, German fighter units had largely abandoned close-in attacks on well-formed bomber groups. Their new doctrine focused on isolating damaged bombers, separated from formations, attacking stragglers that couldn't maintain defensive coordination, and engaging during assembly or return phases, when formations were looser and defensive fire less concentrated. This strategic retreat represented a profound shift. American heavy bombers, which had been suffering catastrophic losses just 8 months earlier, had achieved something approaching air supremacy, not because their aircraft had improved dramatically, not because German fighters had degraded significantly, but because American gunners had learned to shoot 2 seconds into the future. The Pacific application. The predictive firing revolution developed over Europe found immediate application in the Pacific theater, though the tactical environment was substantially different. Japanese fighters, generally lighter and more maneuverable than German aircraft, used different attack patterns. The longer engagement ranges over water, better visibility, and different aircraft performance characteristics required adaptation of the core doctrine. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 20th Air Force's B-29 operations against Japan, recognized predictive firing's potential and mandated its implementation across all bomber groups under his command, starting in January 1945. The B-29's advanced fire control system, with its centralized gun direction and computing sites, made predictive firing even more effective than in B-17 seconds. The B-29's General Electric Fire Control System included analog computers that calculated deflection automatically. When gunners added predictive fire doctrine, firing at commitment rather than at close range, the combination proved devastating. Japanese fighters attempting to attack B-29 formations faced not just predictive fire from individual gunners, but coordinated predictive fire directed by central computers. Staff Sergeant Howard Miller, a gunner aboard the B-29 Dragon Lady operating from Saipan, described the system's effectiveness in a March 1945 letter home. "The Japanese pilots don't have a chance. Our computers predict where they'll be. We start shooting when they're still miles out. By the time they get to the firing range, they've been flying through our bullets for 5 seconds. It's not a fight anymore. It's an execution." The statistical results from Pacific operations validated the European findings. B-29 groups using predictive fire doctrine and centralized fire control showed 63% fewer losses to fighter attack compared to earlier operations using traditional defensive tactics. Japanese fighters, which had been deadly threats during initial B-29 raids in late 1944, became increasingly ineffective by spring 1945. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Major Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving ace, encountered B-29 predictive fire during a combat mission over Tokyo on March 10, 1945. His post-war memoir described the experience. "The super fortresses began firing when we were still 3,000 meters away. Not scattered fire, concentrated, heavy fire in exactly the paths we needed to fly for our attacks. Their gunners weren't reacting to our movements, they were predicting them. By the time we closed to the firing range, several of our aircraft were already damaged or destroyed. It was like attacking a fortress that could see into the future." The long-term legacy. The predictive firing techniques developed during 1943 and 1944 represented more than just a tactical innovation. They demonstrated a fundamental principle that would shape military technology for decades. In high-speed combat, reactive systems lose to predictive systems. Modern air defense networks operate on this same principle. The Aegis combat system used by US Navy ships doesn't wait for incoming missiles to enter close range before engaging. It predicts their trajectories and launches interceptors to arrive at predicted intercept points. The system is shooting 2 seconds, or 20 seconds, or 2 minutes early, depending on range and closing speed. Fighter aircraft fire control systems work identically. The APG-81 radar in the F-35 Lightning II doesn't just track targets. It predicts where they will be based on current flight parameters and positions the aircraft accordingly. When the pilot fires, he's not aiming at where the enemy is. He's shooting at where the computer predicts the enemy will be when weapons arrive. Even personal small arms have incorporated predictive principles. The XM-25 grenade launcher, designed for U.S. Army infantry, includes a laser rangefinder and ballistic computer that calculates where to detonate grenades to hit targets behind cover. Soldiers shoot at empty air above or beside visible cover, trusting the computer to predict the correct burst point. The transformation from reactive to predictive thinking in combat systems traces directly to those bomber gunners over Germany in 1944 who learned to fire at empty sky and trust mathematics over instinct. They proved that prediction beats reaction, that shooting where the enemy will be beats shooting where he is, that 2 seconds of foresight provides decisive advantage. Dr. Richard Hallion, an Air Force historian, reflected on this transformation in a 1997 lecture at the Naval War College. The predictive fire revolution of World War II represented the first practical application of what we now call sensor-shooter integration. Gunners became sensors, feeding targeting data to their own weapons systems. They observed commitment, calculated prediction, and engaged proactively. Every modern combat system, from Patriot missiles to F-22 fighters, operates on elaborations of this same basic principle. The human element. The men who implemented predictive firing never thought of themselves as revolutionaries. They were 19- and 20-year-old kids from farms and factories, thrust into industrial warfare at 25,000 feet, doing whatever their instructors told them might keep them alive one more mission. Staff Sergeant Michael Rafferty, who opened this story firing at German fighters 3,000 yards distant over the Rhineland, flew 31 combat missions using predictive fire techniques. He survived the war, returned to Boston, worked 43 years as a machinist, and rarely spoke about his service. In an oral history interview conducted by the Veterans History Project in 2003, 3 years before his death, Rafferty reflected on predictive firing. "We didn't understand the mathematics. I didn't need to. We just did what they told us. Watch for the fighter to commit. Start shooting. Count to 2. Usually by 2, he was in our fire or breaking away. It felt wrong every single time, shooting when the guy was barely visible. But it worked. And guys who didn't do it died. So we did it." Approximately 176,000 American aerial gunners received training during World War II. By war's end, virtually all had been trained in predictive fire techniques. They represented one of the largest-scale applications of predictive modeling in human history. Tens of thousands of young men serving as human computational elements in a vast distributed system designed to shoot into the future. Their success saved countless lives. Bomber loss rates, which had reached catastrophic levels in autumn 1943, declined steadily through 1944 as predictive firing spread through the force. 8th Air Force statistics show clear correlation between adoption of predictive doctrine and decline in bomber losses. In October 1943, before predictive firing, the 8th Air Force lost 9.1% of bombers dispatched per mission. By October 1944, with predictive firing fully implemented, loss rates had dropped to 1.9% per mission. That represented thousands of aircraft that returned home instead of being shot down. Tens of thousands of crew members who survived the war instead of dying over. Germany. The cost was measured in ammunition. Monthly 50 caliber expenditure by 8th Air Force bombers increased from approximately 47 million rounds in October 1943 to 92 million rounds in October 1944. American industry, producing ammunition at rates that staggered comprehension, kept the guns fed. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri alone produced over 3.9 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition during the war. But ammunition was replaceable. Trained aircrews were not. Every bomber that returned safely because predictive fire deterred or destroyed, attacking fighters represented not just 11 saved lives, but 11 highly trained specialists whose replacement cost months of training and hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment. The final accounting. The transformation of American bomber defensive gunnery from reactive to predictive engagement represents one of World War II's most significant tactical evolutions. It wasn't dramatic like the development of radar or the atomic bomb. It didn't involve revolutionary new technology or massive industrial programs. It was simply the recognition that in modern high-speed combat, 2 seconds of prediction provided decisive advantage. German fighter pilots, who had dominated the skies over Europe during much of 1943, found themselves increasingly outmatched during 1944, not because American aircraft improved dramatically, but because American gunners learned to shoot at where they would be instead of where they were. The technique violated every instinct. It felt like panic fire, like wasting ammunition, like giving up marksmanship for spray and pray. But the mathematics were undeniable. Firing at commitment, approximately 2 seconds before fighters entered traditional engagement range, meant bullets arrived precisely when fighters entered their own firing envelopes. German pilots had to fly through American fire to attack, and increasingly, they chose not to. Loss rates for German fighters attacking well-formed bomber groups reached unsustainable levels by summer 1944. Experienced pilots, irreplaceable after years of warfare, died attacking formations whose defensive fire seemed almost prescient. The Luftwaffe never solved the problem. They tried technological answers, heavier weapons, longer-range rockets, jet fighters. They tried tactical answers, roller coaster attacks, high-speed passes, standoff engagement. Nothing worked against the fundamental mathematics of predictive fire. By late 1944, German fighter units largely abandoned close-in attacks on bomber formations, conceding air superiority not through defeat in combat, but through inability to engage effectively. The young American gunners who learned to fire 2 seconds early, who trained themselves to ignore instinct and trust mathematics, never understood the full significance of what they'd accomplished. They were just trying to survive their tours, complete their missions, and go home. But in learning to shoot into the future, they demonstrated a principle that would define combat for generations to come. In the age of missiles and computers, of radar and laser guidance, of autonomous weapons and artificial intelligence, every system operates on the same fundamental insight those bomber gunners discovered over Germany in 1944. Don't react to where threats are. Predict where they will be. Don't wait for commitment to prove itself. Recognize commitment and engage immediately. Don't trust instinct over mathematics. Calculate, predict, and fire into the future. The gunners themselves would have laughed at such grand analysis. They weren't philosophers. They were kids with Browning M2s, watching German fighters come at them through thin air at 26,000 feet, doing what they'd been taught, counting to 2, and hoping mathematics would prove stronger than luck. It did. And they came home. And the war was won, in part, because someone figured out that 2 seconds of prediction beat an eternity of reaction. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.